If the only acceptable outcome of war is a peace, and the only sustainable peace is a just peace, then it is essential to answer the question, what is peace? Welcome to the Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired, and among other things, former instructor for the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College and the Naval War College. This is the sixth in a series about ending war. My intent is to explore the necessary steps to move forward from war towards peace. If you think these podcasts are worthwhile, please hit like, subscribe, or follow. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy begins its section on the philosophy of peace by saying, peace is notoriously difficult to define, and this poses a special challenge for articulating any comprehensive philosophy of peace. Now, defining peace is not a new challenge. Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine grappled with this question, as have modern political scientists since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to attack this problem in a practical way with the full understanding that many people, including some of my colleagues, will disagree with my approach and my conclusion. Since the time of Plato and Aristotle, there have been two challenges to defining peace. The first is describing the normal state of affairs in international relations, and the second is the nature of peace itself. The first challenge is opposite viewpoints in describing the normal state of affairs. The classic or realist view presumes that conflict is the normal state of mankind, and the notion of peace is inferred because there are periods of non-violent human competition between wars. This was the opinion of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, author of Leviathan. He believed that war and conflict was the natural state of mankind, defining peace simply as the time that is not war. Hobbes' thoughts continue to be very influential, but he was only one voice. Writing in the same century, the German jurist Samuel von Pufendorf disagreed, maintaining that the state of nature is not that of war, but of peace. He wrote, "When men observe duties in their relations with one another, it is called peace." A third near contemporary, Hugo Grotius, considered the father of international law and who I've mentioned before in these podcasts, took a third view, assuming that neither war nor peace was the natural state of affairs, but existed as correlatively opposite legal constructs, each governed by laws proper to each and inappropriate to the other. Today, and despite the realities of the past 2 centuries or more, it's mostly taken for granted that peace is the normal state in international relations. Now, this is held by many political scientists and diplomats despite the reality that there are today 110 armed conflicts in the world. If more than half the world states are engaged in an armed conflict, then the notion of peace as the normal state is certainly open to debate. In my opinion, the normalcy of peace is more likely a Western perspective and may not be globally applicable. Regardless of my own opinion, the construct of peace as the normal state in international relations is one of aspiration, or what ought to be, rather than reality, or what is. This disagreement about the normalcy of peace or war affects the second challenge on the nature of peace itself. Again, there are two competing concepts. The first is negative peace, looking on peace simply as the absence of war. The second is positive peace, which is based on the idea that peace depends upon attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. This idea is expressed in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Peace Index. Other descriptions of positive peace depend upon difficult or impossible to measure concepts, such as relationships, human values, and harmony. This positive peace approach orients on peaceful societies rather than defining sustainable and just peace between nations. Perhaps the idea is that stable societies are less likely to go to war. For the purposes of this podcast, which is about war, and more particularly in this series of ending war and establishing peace, I'll look at moving from war to peace between or among nations rather than society building. Now, this demands a definition that can provide objective criteria, things we can build into a peace agreement and measure in execution. To do this, I'll go back to Hugo Grotius. Wars, like fires, may begin spontaneously. Some, like fires, peter out on their own accord as both sides are spent, but the fire is left to smolder until it bursts into flame again. Most conflicts, however, end with some form of peace agreement or treaty. Grotius described two kinds of peace agreements or treaties, one of inequality and one of equality. Treaties of inequality can be thought of as examples of negative peace. One side has won the war and imposes its will on the other, and that other has no choice but to submit. Now, this kind of peace may be just or unjust depending upon intent. The example I gave in the last episode of the Treaty of Versailles was an unjust treaty designed both to punish German states and assert dominance over them by the Western Allies. Another example would be the peace treaties imposed by the Roman Republic on the Phoenicians after each of the Punic Wars. The problem with these unequal treaties is that, as Immanuel Kant cautioned, they plant the seeds for future war. Now, there are other cases where the unequal treaty presents a negative peace as a necessary precondition for a later positive peace. This preconditional peace does three things. First, it stops the fighting. Second, it applies justice to those responsible for initiating or prosecuting an unjust war. Third, it initiates a process of reform within the defeated state or states, leading to the positive peace and a treaty of equality. The best example of this was the end of the Second World War. The Potsdam Agreement ending the war in Europe was so unequal that the German people or its government was not even consulted and was essentially a declaration of occupation. The treaties of Paris in 1947 established unequal treaties with the former European Axis allies. This was followed by a convention of less inequality with Germany in 1952 and a treaty of relative equality in 1954, ending official occupation and allowing West Germany to join NATO. Ultimately, the Helsinki Final Act of 1978 and the 4+2 Agreement of 1990 established the German states, and then Germany, as full, equal members of the community of nations. According to Grotius, this is the goal of a treaty of equality, where the formerly warring states commit themselves to equal participation in the law of nations, or the law of peace. Several ceasefires in Africa, followed by comprehensive peace agreements, can also be viewed from the perspective of moving from negative peace to positive peace. But what is peace? Aquinas described peace as being indirectly a work of justice. The reestablishment of that justice between or among warring parties is essential. Surprisingly, the best description I've found of the qualities of that just and sustainable peace is from the current Department of Defense Dictionary of Terms, which describes peacemaking as settlements that arrange an end to a dispute and resolve issues that led to it. Resolving the issues that led to war means to establish or reestablish the justice that makes peace possible. So again, what is peace? For the purposes of moving from war to peace, I believe that peace can be defined as the situation where nations or states operate according to international law under conditions recognized as just and equal. That peace is the only acceptable objective of the art of war from ancient to modern eras. So why doesn't it seem to work that way? That forms the next series of presentations in the ancient art of modern warfare.